In the quiet town of Knaresborough, Yorkshire, there is a cave. Locals say for centuries anything left in its waters would turn to stone, shoes, baskets, and even a child's teddy bear. But that's not what makes it famous. No, the cave is remembered because of the woman who was born there, Ursula Southile, better known as Mother Shipton. They said that she was hideous at birth, that her mother, a teenage orphan accused of witchcraft, gave birth to her alone in that cave during a thunderstorm. They whispered that the baby was no ordinary child, and she would grow into Britain's most feared and respected cunning woman. As she grew, so did her reputation. People claimed that she could see the future, that she predicted the rise of Queen Elizabeth I, the Great Fire of London, and even the end of the world. Rich men and desperate villagers alike travelled for miles hoping to hear their fortunes, to be healed, or to have their curses lifted. Was she a prophetess? A cunning woman? A fraud? Or something else entirely? Welcome to the Lorekeepers Library, where the past is more alive than you think. I'm Chris, your guide through the shadowy corridors of folklore and forgotten history. If you love stories of magic, mystery, and the people history tried to erase, make sure you like and subscribe. And if you enjoyed today's tale, consider sharing it, because the world of folklore storytelling only survives as long as we keep telling the tales. So let's open the book on the cunning folk of Britain. For centuries across England and Scotland, there were many people who dealt with more than just herbs and prayers. They dealt in magic, but not the kind whispered about in fearful church sermons or written in the accusations of witch trials. The cunning folk were healers, protectors, and problem solvers. They were the ones people sought when life took a turn for the worse. A sick child, a vanishing herd of cattle, a marriage on the brink of collapse, or a run of terrible luck. All could be signs of something unnatural at work. And while the church could offer prayers and the village doctor could bleed a patient with leeches, the cunning folk had something neither could provide: charms, spells, and knowledge of unseen forces. They operated in the space between mystic and practical. Unlike witches, who were accused of causing harm, cunning folk were seen as defenders against dark magic. They broke curses, found stolen goods, healed the sick, and even crafted love charms. Their methods varied from place to place. In some parts of England, cunning men and women carved protective symbols into talismans to ward off spirits. In Wales, they used ancient incantations alongside Christian prayers. In Scotland, they performed divination with water and fire to uncover hidden truths. What's most fascinating is how they blended magic with religion. Many cunning folk carried a Bible and used the Psalms as spells and invoked names of saints and angels. To them, this wasn't blasphemy. It was simply another tool in their craft. And for the villagers who came to them in desperation, results mattered more than doctrine. But who were these people? Were they trained? Did they inherit their skills? Or were they born with them? And some cunning folk were said to have second sight, a supernatural gift allowing them to see spirits, hidden treasures, or the future. Others claimed to have learned their craft from a mysterious teacher or a travelling wise man, an elderly relative, or even, in some tales, the devil himself. One thing was certain: they were both valued and feared, revered for their abilities, yet always walking a fine line with the authorities. The cunning folk held a unique and precarious place in society, and as their influence grew, so did the suspicions of those powers. The cunning folk were not a secret society, nor were they confined to one region. They appeared in villages and towns across Britain, each with their own unique skills, reputation, and in some cases, enemies. Some were feared, some were revered, and others became legendary. Let's start with perhaps the most famous cunning one of them all, Ursula Southile, also known as Mother Shipton. Born in a cave near Knaresborough in Yorkshire, Mother Shipton was rumoured to have been deformed at birth, which only fueled speculation about her supernatural origin. Raised by a local family after her mother was sent to a nunnery, Mother Shipton grew into a woman with an uncanny ability for prophecy. She predicted the rise of Queen Elizabeth I, the Great Fire of London, and even the invention of iron ships. Whether or not these prophecies were truly hers is debatable. Many were written after her death, but one thing is clear: In her own time, she was known and feared as a cunning woman. People would travel for miles around to seek her counsel, hoping for insight into the future or remedies for their ailments. She sold charms and potions, gave cryptic advice that often seemed to come true. But unlike the stereotypical witch of folklore, she wasn't persecuted. Instead, she became a figure of legend, her name enduring long after her death. Today, you can still visit Mother Shipton's cave, where the water supposedly turned objects to stone. This is perhaps a lingering echo of her magic. While Mother Shipton was famous for her prophecies, John Harris of Wales was also known for something more dramatic, his Book of Powerful Spells. Born in the late 18th century, Harris trained as a doctor, but was better known for his skills in divination, healing and protection against witchcraft. People said he owned a great magical book, filled with ancient knowledge and spells so powerful that no one dared open it after his death. His reputation was such that even the local clergy sought his help when things went wrong. One tale claims that Harris was once called upon to retrieve stolen property. Using his mystic knowledge, he allegedly identified the thief without ever leaving his home. This ability to uncover secrets made him both highly respectable and also deeply feared. And even after his death, legends persisted. His magical book was supposedly hidden away by his family, and it's said that anyone who tried to read it without permission would be struck dead on the spot. If there was ever a cunning man who walked the fine line between healer and sorcerer, it was James Murrell, the so-called Wizard of Essex. Operating in the town of Hadley, Murrell was one of the last and most famous cunning men in England. Unlike many before him, he lived during a time where belief in magic was starting to wane. But that didn't stop people from seeking his help. Murrell was known for his deep knowledge of astrology, herbal medicine and spells. He used an almanac to calculate fortunes, crafted charms against witches, and even performed exorcisms. He was also a skilled healer, using a mix of herbs, prayers, and magical symbols to treat ailments. One particular eerie story tells of a woman who came to him, believing she had been cursed. Murrell, employing an old magical technique, took a fresh heart, some say from a sheep, placed it in a pot, and performed a ritual. And by morning, the woman claimed the curse had lifted. Whether this was true magic or simply the power of belief, it cemented Murrell's reputation as a man who could break any spell. He died in 1860, but his legend endures, with stories of his power still told in Essex today. Now moving to Cornwall, we find Granny Boswell, a cunning woman known for her charms, herbal remedies, and folk magic. She was a member of the Romani people, whose traditions of healing and divination blended with the local Cornish belief in Pella magic. Pellas believed the magical term for cunning folk. Granny Boswell's magic wasn't just about spells and curses, it was deeply practical. She provided love charms, fertility remedies, and protective talismans, and the people from all walks of life came for her help. Her Romani heritage made her an outsider, yet she was widely respected in Cornwall. Even as the 19th century brought increased skepticism towards folk magic, her reputation remained strong. Now, not all cunning folk were safe from persecution. Isabel, a Scottish woman tried for witchcraft in 1662, is a rare and unsettling case. Her trial records contain some of the most detailed confessions of witchcraft ever documented in Scotland. Gowdy claimed to have met the devil, flown through the air and attended magical gatherings. But what makes her case strange is that she volunteered these confessions. No torture, no pressing, just seemingly spontaneous outpouring of supernatural claims. Historians debated whether she was delusional, seeking attention, or influenced by local folk beliefs. But her story highlights an important truth. The line between cunning folk and accused witches was dangerously thin. The path to becoming a cunning man or woman wasn't as simply as deciding one day to pick up a book of spells and start handing out charms. Unlike priests or physicians, there was no universities, no formal apprenticeships, and no official titles. Instead, knowledge was passed down through oral tradition, secret teachings, and personal experience. But how did someone become a cunning folk? Who decided they were ready, and what risks did they face? Some cunning folks were born into the craft. They learned from a parent or grandparent, watching as remedies were prepared, as charms crafted, and as desperate villagers whispered their troubles across the threshold. A cunning father might teach his son how to divine the location of stolen goods, or a wise woman might pass her knowledge of herbs to her granddaughter. These family lines of cunning folk often held regional reputations across generations. Such figure was John Harris of Wales, whose family was said to possess a grimoire filled with powerful magic. And once his son attempted to continue his work, but when he opened the book after his father's death, he supposedly dropped dead on the spot. A stark warning about meddling with forces one does not fully understand. There are others who didn't need to be taught. They were simply born with the power. In Scotland and parts of Wales, certain individuals believed to have the second sight, the ability to see spirits, glimpse the future, and sense hidden dangers. This wasn't a skill one could learn. It sometimes manifested naturally. People who had it often experienced visions from a young age, whether they wanted to or not. They would eventually be called upon for their insight. If a child spoke of things that yet not happened, saw ghosts others could not see, or instinctively knew that someone was lying, they were often believed to be destined for a path of a cunning folk. Then there were some cunning folk who didn't inherit their craft but learned it from a mentor. This wasn't always a parent. Sometimes it was an older cunning man or woman, a wandering wise person, and in dark tales, a supernatural figure. Many cunning folk believed to have been trained by a mysterious stranger, someone who appeared suddenly, imparted wisdom, and then vanished without a trace. Some say they met their teachers at a crossroad at midnight, others in the depths of an ancient forest. And then there was the rumours of dealings with the devil. These stories weren't always taken literally. Many were spread by enemies or authorities looking for an excuse to prosecute. But the idea of gaining forbidden knowledge in exchange for something lingered in people's minds. Now, unlike village witches who relied on intuition and personal experience, many cunning folk owned books. Sometimes these were called grimoires or spell books. These weren't always dark tomes filled with demonology. Many contained practical recipes, protective prayers, and alchemical formulas, and even astrological charts. There are some famous grimoires used by cunning folks. These include the Book of St. Cyprian, a legendary manual of magic, blending Christian and pagan traditions. There was the 6th and 7th books of Moses, a mystical text that's said to contain powerful biblical magic. And then there was the Long Lost Friend, a German and American grimoire full of folk remedies and spells. They were popular among cunning folk in the 18th and 19th century. However, owning a book of magic was dangerous. During the periods of witchcraft persecution, possessing one could be enough to land someone in serious trouble. Being a cunning folk wasn't just about knowing spells, it was about walking a delicate line. They had to convince their communities that they were helping, not harming. If a cunning child, he was praised. But if that same child died a week later, whispers might begin. Did his magic fail, or did he mean for this to happen? And if a cunning woman crafted a love charm that worked too well, and a jealous rival suspected foul play, she could quickly find herself accused of witchcraft. Many cunning folk defended themselves by keeping their practices Christianized. They would invoke the names of saints, use biblical verses in their spells, and assure their clients that the power came from God and not the devil. Still, as history progressed, the forces that once tolerated them soon began to turn on them. And by the 18th and 19th century, authorities started cracking down on cunning folk, branding them as frauds, con artists, and even witches. And with the rise of science and industrialization and modern medicine, belief in folk magic began to fade. But as the 18th and 19th centuries progressed, these magical practitioners began to face a new challenge, one that they would eventually lead to their decline. For centuries, cunning folk lived in the grey area of society, respected by the people but always under the watchful eye of the authorities. Unlike accused witches, cunning folk weren't typically burned at the stake, but they didn't mean that they were safe. At first, the law tolerated them. After all, they were seen as useful. They healed the sick, protected against evil, and even assisted in criminal investigations. But as the centuries passed, attitudes changed. The church, the government, and later, medical professionals began to view them as a threat. By the 16th and 17th century, Britain's rulers had decided magic was dangerous no matter how it was being used. And the first major legal crackdown came with the Witchcraft Act of 1542. This was introduced by King Henry VIII. This law made witchcraft, sorcery, and conjuring spirits punishable by death. Though aimed at so-called malefic witches, or those who use magic to harm, it also casts suspicion on all magical practitioners, including the cunning folk. And later, under Elizabeth I, the Witchcraft Act of 1563 softened the punishment, but it still made it illegal to practice magic of any kind. And then came King James I's Witchcraft Act of 1604, a law that escalated the fear of magic to deadly levels. James, an outspoken believer in demonic possession, abolished loopholes that were previously allowed cunning folk to practice relatively unscathed. Even good magic, divination, healing spells and protective charms became illegal. This was the turning point. For the first time, cunning folk found themselves prosecuted alongside witches. Now, most cunning folk escaped witch trials because they were seen as helpers and not harmers. But when suspicion turned against them, they had very little defence. One tragic example was John Walsh, a cunning man from Dorset, who was tried for witchcraft in 1566. He claimed to use spirits to locate stolen goods, a common service among cunning folk. But under questioning, he admitted to conjuring spirits for other purposes, which led to his conviction, and he was sentenced to death by hanging. In Scotland, where witch trials were particularly brutal, cunning folk were often found themselves accused by association. One such case was Isabel Godwin, who confessed to witchcraft in 1662. And as previously said, unlike most accused witches, she didn't deny the charges. She gave vivid and detailed descriptions of meetings with the devil, shape-shifting and summoning storms. And this did lead to historians believing that she may be mentally ill, or by telling the authorities what they wanted to hear. But others argue that knowledge of folk magic and cunning craft led to her downfall. In England, cunning folk were sometimes reported to the authorities by rival healers or suspicious neighbours. If someone's cures failed or a spell backfired, the cunning person could quickly become the villain in the story. By the 18th century, witch trials had largely ended, but cunning folk still faced legal risks. The government shifted its focus from religious persecutions to stamping out fraudulent magical practitioners. And the Witchcraft Act of 1736 officially repealed earlier witchcraft laws, marking the end of executions for witchcraft in Britain. However, it replaced them with new laws against pretending to have supernatural powers. This meant cunning folk could now be prosecuted not as witches, but as con artists. And throughout the 19th century, cunning folk were frequently taken to court under the Vagrancy Act of 1824, which criminalised fortune-telling, astrology, and the use of magical knowledge for financial gain. One notable case was James Murrell, the Wizard of Essex, who was investigated multiple times but managed to evade serious punishment. He was clever. He framed his work as a form of medicine and Christian prayer rather than outright magic. However, others weren't so lucky. One of the last high-profile cunning folk trials was Jane Rebecca York in 1944. Yes, that's 1944. York was a spiritualist and cunning woman who used seances, fortune-telling and projective charms. She was convicted under the Fraudulent Mediums Act, one of the last remnants of Britain's anti-magic laws. And by the 20th century, belief in cunning folk had declined sharply. Science and modern medicine and the rise of organised law enforcement had replaced many of their roles in society. But did they truly vanish, or did they simply change names? Even today, elements of cunning craft survived in folk remedies, modern spiritual practices and local superstitions. The last cunning folk may have faded from villages in Britain, but their legacies are still felt in ways we speak of, such as luck, protection, and unseen forces. And if you ever find yourself in an old English town hearing whispers of a local healer or a mysterious wise woman in the countryside, remember, some traditions never truly die. The cunning folk of Britain may have faded, but their influence never truly disappeared. Instead, the traditions adapted, merged, and re-emerged in new forms. From modern folk magic to alternative medicine, from ghost hunting television shows to Wiccan rituals, echoes of the practices still shape our world today. But where did their knowledge go? And who carries their work into the 21st century? One of the most lasting legacies of cunning folk is their knowledge of herbs and natural healing. For centuries, cunning folk were the go-to healers for people who couldn't afford or didn't trust doctors. They treated everything from fevers to broken bones using herbal poultices, tinctures, and salves. Today, many of these remedies have been validated by modern science. For example, willow bark was used by cunning folk to treat pain and fever, which contains salicin, which is the natural compound behind aspirin. Also honey and garlic, common in folk cures for infection, and both have proven antibacterial properties. And the rise of herbal medicine, homeopathy and holistic healing shows that people still seek natural remedies just as they did centuries ago. Now, many of the cunning folk were also diviners. People used various methods to uncover hidden knowledge. Whether it was a crystal ball, the movement of the stars, or simply a deck of playing cards, they offered guidance on love, fortune and fate. Sounds familiar? That's because these traditions never went away. Instead, they transformed into modern fortune-telling practices, such as tarot reading, the mixture of medieval playing cards, Renaissance mysticism, and cunning craft of fortune-telling. Palmistry, reading the lines of the hands, once a common cunning folk skill, now a staple at psychic fairs. And spiritualism and mediumship, the 19th century spiritualist movement, which sought to communicate with the dead, owes much to its cunning folk traditions of summoning spirits for insight. Even today, people visit psychics, astrologers and clairvoyants for guidance, just as they once sought out the village cunning man or wise woman. Now, cunning folks were protectors, crafting charms, amulets and rituals to ward off evil. And while the fear of witches had faded, protective magic still lingers in everyday superstitions. We hang horseshoes above doors, a common charm against bad luck, once recommended by cunning folk. Knocking on wood, a ritual to prevent misfortune, possibly linked to the old tree-based folk magic. And also carrying a rabbit's foot, a holdover of talismans made by cunning folk for good fortune. Even practices like saging a home to remove negative energy has roots in folk magic and their cleansing magics. And probably the most visible legacy of cunning folk is modern witchcraft, Wiccan and folk magic traditions. Though cunning folk were not witches in historical sense, their practice inspired later folk magic movements. In the 20th century, figures like Gerald Gardner, the founder of Wiccan, drew upon old cunning folk traditions to shape the rituals and spells for modern paganism. And today, movements such as hedge witchcraft, green witchcraft, and traditional witchcraft focus on things like herbal magic, divination, folk charms and spell work. In many ways, today's modern witches and folk healers are the spiritual descendants of cunning folk, using old wisdom in a new age. And though the cunning folk may be gone, they are alive and well in stories, movies and TV shows. Many fictional wizards, witches and magical healers are based on real-life cunning folk. Such examples are like John Constantine from DC Comics and the TV show Constantine, a modern cunning man who fights dark forces using spells, charms and occult knowledge. The Witcher series. Geralt, even though called a Witcher, has much in common with cunning folk, such as helping villagers with supernatural problems in exchange for coin. And there's also The Good Witch, a Hallmark TV series, a modern reimagining of a wise woman figure blending herbalism, intuition and gentle magic. Even detective shows like Sherlock Holmes borrow from the legacy of cunning folk, and many historical cunning men acted as local detectives solving crimes through intuition and folklore. The last official cunning folk may have died out centuries ago, but some argue they never truly disappeared. In small towns and rural villages, whispers about circulating about local healers, spiritualists and wise folk who know things they shouldn't, those who find lost objects and cure illnesses and often guidance just like their ancestors did. Could some modern-day herbalists, faith healers or psychics continue an ancient tradition without even realizing it? So maybe next time you hear of someone with an uncanny ability to heal, or see the unseen or protect against bad luck, you'll be wondering, is it just superstition, or if the cunning folk never really left us? And with that, thank you for joining me today in the Lorekeepers Library, where we've uncovered the world of the cunning folk, those wise healers, mystics and protectors of forgotten knowledge who once walked the villages of Britain. Though their time has passed, their legacy still lingers in herbal remedies, superstitions, and the quiet whispers of those who still believe in the unseen forces. If you enjoyed today's journey and want to help keep folklore alive, be sure to like and subscribe and share this episode, as knowledge, like magic, is meant to be passed on. And the more we share these stories, the further they travel. We'd also love to hear from you, so please drop a comment below and tell us your favourite piece of folklore, whether it's a local legend, a family superstition, or maybe you had a cunning folk in your family's history. Let's keep the conversation going and keep these tales alive. And so, until next time, keep exploring the world with wonder.